Okay, let's shift gear for the US. There's a lot of things happening in the US, seems to me. All right. Tell me what you did this weekend. It seems like there's a peace summit, right? On Sunday, yesterday.
Well, there
So
was a
can you give
National
a
Day of Action. August
okay?
6th is the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And so
Mhm.
there was a big rally at the United Nations in New York City. And then there were rallies around the country, calling for peace with Russia, peace with China. I was there with my organization, the Center for Political Innovation. We had a big banner, peace with Russia, peace with China. We were there, and we were part of the rally in New York City. We organized the rally in Chicago. We also organized the rally in Portland, Oregon. And there were a number of other rallies around the country. There were rallies in Houston. There were rallies all across California and different places in California. It was a national day of action, and there were, I believe, rallies in other countries as well, in Germany, and in Britain and Sweden and other places. It was very important. So, I mean, the danger of war is very real, and so the anniversary of Hiroshima is important. There was recently that film Oppenheimer that came out, which I haven't had an opportunity to see, but kind of putting people on notice about the danger of nuclear war. So yeah, we saw it was an important opportunity. We were glad we were able to participate in the Humanity for Peace mobilization. It's important to support any anti-war activism.
And do you guys do this every year? Is this a yearly event?
No, no,
Okay.
this was based on the circumstances in the world right now. And so I know that, libertarians were involved, the Schiller Institute was involved, different groups were involved. We made a point of supporting the action.
Now I watched that last night, Oppenheimer, just because I
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
just intentionally do it for yesterday because it's an anniversary. It just happened that in my small town, our local movie theater has it, so I went there. And they also had some professors came in. I live in a college town, so there's some physicists came in and give us
Hmm.
talk a little bit before the movie or between the movie. There are two movies. There's a 3 o'clock, there's a 7 o'clock. In between, they had people coming in and talk about it. It's
Wow.
interesting. Yeah, I find that's interesting. But I do want to present the Chinese view on the Hiroshima bombing. Okay,
Okay.
the two bombings. Now, I know that people, I mean, we all should be against the nuclear bombs in anywhere in the world. But if there's ever a justification for a nuclear bomb, I would say Hiroshima is the one. If you know what the Japanese did in China, in Asia in general, I mean, it would be a very hard sell for China to, for the Chinese public to condemn that particular bomb. I just want you to know that. I know it's a tough topic. If you ask me, of course, I'm against the nuclear bomb anywhere in the world. But as a Chinese, it is hard really to condemn that particular one. And that's why it's such a complex topic in my view. And when I was watching Oppenheimer, it's almost like I kind of agree with him because he was supporting the bomb in Japan. Seemed to me like at least that's my takeaway. But then afterwards, when it's next to the hydrogen bomb, he wasn't clear. He's not supporting of that. His idea is not entirely against the hydrogen bomb. He's more like, okay, before we move forward with this all out kind of a nuclear, hydrogen, all these kind of extremely dangerous weapons, we need to think through this thing. We need to have some kind of a process or rule or law or something before we move forward. And for that, he got lots of criticism. And even people are just prosecuting him because of that opinion. I think I probably would agree with him on that one, that before you move forward with even more powerful bombs, maybe you should think through this whole thing. But Hiroshima, I think some people say, okay, it didn't really speed up the war. Without those two bombs, the Japanese will surrender. I'm not so sure. I'm
Well,
not so sure.
well, that's just the facts. I mean, the Japanese had already agreed to surrender on the term that they got to keep their emperor. And then the USA dropped the atomic bombs and they surrendered and got to keep their emperor. I mean, it was the exact same deal they were offered before that. The USA simply wanted to demonstrate to the Soviet Union and the world that they had the atomic bomb. That was the only purpose that the bombing served. It didn't serve a military purpose. And I understand that in Japan, the people who talk about the bombing of Hiroshima are those that are nationalistic and right wing and gloss over the horrendous atrocities that were committed in China and elsewhere. I mean, in the Philippines and in Korea and elsewhere.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
and that that specifically communists in Japan avoid talking about the bombing for that reason, which makes sense, you know, and I can understand that. But I think the important thing is not that it's not like we're trying to say Japan is good in any way. Obviously, you know, what Japan did was horrendous, and Japan's legacy there and the way Japan still conducts itself, you know, censoring textbooks and trying to cover up its atrocities. The way the United States has propped up Japan and, you know, put military bases in Okinawa and done everything they can to build up Japan despite its legacy in the region because they're more interested in fighting China. I think we can acknowledge all of this, but also acknowledge that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not militarily necessary. And it was really more of a threat against the Soviet Union and a threat against China and a threat against other countries than really about defeating Japan. And I think it's also important to point out that more Japanese people died in the firebombing of Tokyo than actually. Yeah, and that's something people don't talk about. You know, I mean, again, I mean, these are all complicated, you know, nuanced issues, but at the end of the day, I mean, yeah, I mean, it wasn't militarily necessary. It didn't serve a military purpose, and you know, it introduced atomic warfare into the world. You know, and it made the world aware of that. And my understanding is also that Roosevelt wanted the atomic bomb project to be a joint project between the Soviet Union and the United States. Winston Churchill prevented that. And that Harry Truman was not aware of the Manhattan Project when he became president, and Stalin knew about it before Harry Truman did. And Stalin actually asked Truman how it was going, and Truman didn't know about it. You know, and you know, so yeah, these are aspects of it that I think are worth pointing out. But I can understand why there would be feeling like that, you know, because of the horrendous things Japan has done, which the West doesn't acknowledge.
No.
Weird. And I would be curious what you think about it. I mean, especially when I was a kid, it doesn't seem to be so much anymore, but you know, in the 90s, there seemed to be this fixation on Japan in American media, and particularly for children, you know, whether it was the cartoons or, you know, and it was a little bit strange. US media had this like weird fixation, not just with Japan, but with the traditional conservative Japan, the stuff we associate with militarism in Japan, which I found to be very odd. Do you know why that might have been? Was that related to the USA building up Japan's economy during these times, the rise of the Asian tiger countries? It was very weird, you know, that American media has this fixation on traditional conservative aspects of Japan.
Well, I don't think I know the reason for that. I can only guess. For a while in the 80s and then probably 90s, the Japanese cartoons are very popular in China too. You know, culture. Yeah, culturally. It just and then in the 80s there are quite a few Japanese movies also very popular. I even watched some of them, even though I was young, so I didn't remember much of them. But I just remember there's a whole bunch of Japanese movie and Japanese TV series came into China, and it was just a big thing. So I don't know. It just maybe just culturally, just not many other competition from Hollywood or from anywhere. In the 80s, not just the Japanese, there were also some Bollywood, you know, Indian movies. Also during that time maybe that's what was the time there wasn't that many domestic good movies and TV series. Could be. Well, also, China.
Go ahead.
Also, China's a big market. You see, always remember that. So it can tolerate a lot of different things. So even domestically, maybe there's a different TV series, but there's always market for an overseas thing if it's good quality, and there are plenty of people who are translating them. So once they're in the market. The 80s, it seems like a lot of Japanese and Indian movies. That was culturally, that was a lot of them, and the cartoons. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that, you know, when it comes to martial arts, it was a Chinese person, Bruce Lee, who made it popular in the United States. He's the one who originally, you know, kind of created in the late 70s the martial arts, you know, craze in American media. But then as, you know, time went on, they suddenly pivoted to making it about Japan, which I think is interesting, you know, and the martial arts stuff. If you look at the movies that came out and the martial arts movies, et cetera, they all kind of pivoted to being about Japan, even though it was China. It was a Chinese person who made it popular originally, you know, Bruce Lee. And also there's people that ask questions about, I guess, Bruce Lee's son, his death. The circumstances around it is very mysterious, right? And people ask questions about, was he intentionally killed? Because you don't work with a real gun on a movie set. And the fact that
Yeah.
someone was working with a real gun, I mean, they say it was just an accident, but what was going on there, and was there political implications for that? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, in China, that's a big conspiracy. You can call it a conspiracy theory because there's no evidence, okay? But people believe he was murdered. Yeah,
Yeah.
plenty of people believe he's murdered. I believe his wife even said something like that. I don't remember exactly what she said, but there are plenty of people think he was murdered. Now, whether he was murdered for political reasons or he just has personal enemies or maybe even racism, because he's pretty big, in Hollywood, it was rare for Chinese to be that big. So there's a lot of theories who killed him or which force killed him. But he seems to be murdered. That seems like a lot of people believe that. Yeah, absolutely. And for a while, the Hong Kong movie in general was very popular too. Also, I think in the 80s, there were a lot of movies from Hong Kong, and there were a lot of high quality movies from Hong Kong, and many of them are very patriotic. Interestingly enough, you will find it's very strange. For the Hong Kong riot, there are people in Hong Kong really seems like the student want to be independent, break out, against the mainland China. But if you watch the 70, 80, their movies, their TV series, they're all very patriotic. They hated the British. I mean, the British are the occupier. There's no question about it. But somehow, I guess once I think it's 1984 is where the agreement between Britain and China agreed that 1997 is the time the Britain is going to return Hong Kong back to China. I think something happened during that period from 84 to 97. The British intentionally brainwashed the people, did a lot of things. They started to introduce democracy. They occupied Hong Kong for so long. They never had any elections or democracy. All of a sudden, on their way out, they started introducing democracy. You see what they're trying to do?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things happened during that time. And for that reason, people in China are still very angry with the British. They're trying to lay a lot of the they call them, bombs along the way for Hong Kong to be not smoothly returning back to China. And Hong Kong is not unique. Britain has been doing that with all kinds of colonies like that. And so I think it's worth noticing that that's the difference. If you watch the 70s, earlier 60s, 80s, their movies, TV series, they all very patriotic. They all kind of see China as a motherland that sooner or later they need to return. That's always the way that it is. But then something changed, and that's what happened in the riot later on. That's what it is. After Hong Kong already be part of China, and then somehow there's people who are not happy. Now there's some underlying problem. Hong Kong's real estate is very expensive. That is a problem. So for lots of people, they cannot afford to live, in a decent place. That is a problem. But that's not a unique problem for Hong Kong. Lots of big cities had that problems. But it was, of course, the CIA is involved, and people even find evidence, like the taking pictures where CIA representative, they don't say it's the CIA representative, some U.S. Consulate representative meeting the leaders, the riot leaders. There are pictures of them. Okay, so it's not even any argument about that. It's just the fact that the CIA is involved. But in general, that's how people see it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing that as far as historically with Hong Kong, a lot of the free market material, the material that were pushed in the United States to promote free market neoliberal economics, focused on Hong Kong's economic successes and tried to point to Hong Kong as an example of the free market. And that was completely ridiculous because Hong Kong has a huge amount of state government involvement in the economy. And on top of that, in the 1980s in particular, a big section of Hong Kong's economy was the illegal drug trade. When Hong Kong was still a British protectorate, it was a center of the global heroin, manufacturing. I mean, a huge amount of bribing of police and all of this. And Milton Friedman and others would write books about how great Hong Kong was because it was a great example of the free market and heavily government involved economy, heavily amount of corruption. And the other thing is, now when you talk about the Hong Kong riots and all of that, that was so obviously from the United States and fomented by the United States. And my understanding is that there was even an app that was created that would track the police in Hong Kong for the protesters, enable them to see where the police were so that they could attack them. And there's always talk of foreign meddling. Could you imagine what the result would be if there had been an app that enabled like Black Lives Matter protesters to attack American police? That would never be tolerated. That app being created by I think it was Apple. They didn't create it, but they were marketing it, they were promoting it. That was essentially a military action. I mean, that was military at that point, when you're creating an app to track the police, to enable people to violently attack the police. And you look at these Hong Kong protesters lighting people on fire, and I mean, American media continued to call them peaceful. Oh, they're peaceful, storming government buildings. January 6th, our capital was stormed, and it was the end of time. We've talked about it endlessly, but the Hong Kong protesters stormed the government buildings over and over and over again, and that was just tolerated and celebrated in American media. So the utter hypocrisy there, and the U.S. backing of trying to foment the unrest is massive. And that the people doing the rioting were the wealthiest and most privileged people, but it was the population, the working class. They're the ones that feel loyalty to China, that went out to fight these people. It was the rich kids that are dazzled by American media. They're dazzled by Twitter and Facebook. They're the ones that went out and did this. And there were probably other people who had grievances that were manipulated, and that always happens, right? You have people that are upset about legitimate things, and they get kind of taken advantage of and mixed in with what's clearly a U.S. foreign policy operation. So it's very unfortunate.
I can just tell you, I was there in 2019. I was in Hong Kong briefly. And one day I was coming down to go out to get my dinner. Okay. As I was leaving in the lobby, there were hotel people in the lobby, stop all the guests going out. They were telling us, they said that these people are coming, and they're referring to those rioters. So it turns out outside my hotel, there's a park. So those rioters are coming through subways or something. They are coming to the park to do something. We don't know what it was. But at least the hotel people are worried that those people will be violent, that it's unsafe for us to leave the hotel. So they were actually waiting in the lobby, telling all the guests that those people are coming, and suggest us not to leave the hotel. I mean, it was that bad. Okay.
Yeah, and what was the issue of the protest? I mean, that's the important thing. People want to make, Hong Kong's a free. No. What was the actual issue? Was extradition, which was that, if you go to the Chinese mainland and break the law, right, and then you go to Hong Kong sends you back to the Chinese mainland, to stand trial. That's how it would be in any other country. In the United States, we don't have a law that, if you go to New York City and if you're from Ohio and you go to New York City and break the law, and then you go back to Ohio, they handle it in Ohio because Ohio is like a special place. No, we don't have any such special treatment. And it was China's sovereignty that was in question here. It was whether or not the Chinese mainland had the right to prosecute people for crimes on the Chinese mainland, and enforce their own laws in their own region against people who happen to be residents of Hong Kong. And I mean, it's just completely and utterly ridiculous. And the reason the extradition was fought so badly, it was because it was wealthy businessmen in Hong Kong wanted to be able to go to the Chinese mainland and break the law and not be held accountable for it. They wanted to be able to break the law in the Chinese mainland and have these special courts in Hong Kong that are very favorable to them, that do business with them, handle it. Well, no, I mean, that's ridiculous. And the fact that China's sovereignty as a country, they didn't have the right to basically use their own court system within their own country. That's completely ridiculous. And that was the basis of the protests. And there's just no argument there, right? That's why they always want to make it about something else. They want to make it about Hong Kong sovereignty. They want to make it about democracy and blah, blah, blah. But the real issue was the extradition treaty, and their demand was ridiculous.
And the fact that the Hong Kong government want to have some kind of treaty with mainland, it actually shows the mainland respect Hong Kong. Otherwise, you don't need a treaty. It's one country. You don't need a treaty at all. The fact that the mainland agreed, okay, let's do a treaty, so to deal with who should take care of what, that means the mainland is respecting Hong Kong's legal system, isn't it? Otherwise, between New York and San Francisco, is there a treaty of how to deal with? No, you don't. You don't need a treaty for that, right? So,
right.
So that's just the mere fact that China agreed, the mainland agreed to have this discussion. I think it shows that the respect for the sovereignty, whatever, the independence judiciary system of Hong Kong. All right. So there's no argument there. And it's all started with the murder that happened in Taipei. So that's how it started. The guy killed his girlfriend, the pregnant girlfriend, and cut her into pieces.
Wow.
He committed that in Taipei. And then he ran back to Hong Kong. And then Taipei was like, what should we do? And that's when they discovered, okay, what should we do? There is no legal document. So let's discuss some treaties about that. So it started with this murder case. And then the Hong Kong government thinking, okay, let's do it with the mainland, with Macau, with Taipei, with all these kind of special areas. So we have this covered. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. All right. It's just the law and order basic issues. And they made it sounds like, oh, it's about democracy, but no, it's not. It has nothing to do with any of that. And plus, these people are so violent. So they are terrorists. I mean, they are terrorizing. Yeah. My experience, it's terrorizing my community when I was staying there in my hotel. It just, to me, it's like a terrorist. So there is no argument. There is no argument there whatsoever. But the Western media, and then you're talking about the January 6th, and that's part of the reason there's actually zero sympathy in China, I think in a lot of countries in the world, for January 6th. People don't see January 6th as insurrection. They see, okay, these people are protesting. What's the big deal? You call what's happening in Hong Kong a beautiful sight to be seen, to behold. That's what Nancy Pelosi's famous quote. And that has been using, ever since then. Anytime when something bad happened in the US, or gun violence or protest or insurrection, whatever, the Chinese media social media will immediately say, oh, a beautiful sight to behold. That was Nancy Pelosi's description of Hong Kong. Okay, so I mean, that's why so it's just the hypocrisy is incredible. And I actually personally think that a part of the reason the insurgency even happening has something to do with the fact that the US media always beautify these kind of in other countries, right? If you 24 hours telling people these are good things, these people we support. Well, in your own country, people will say, well, if I'm not happy with my government, maybe I can do something as well, isn't it? So I can go to my not really attack, but at least go into my to the capital. What's wrong with that? Other countries, they storm the city council, etc. Right? So it's
well, there's more to it than that, actually, which is that, U.S. media made a really big deal about the fact that in the crowd at January 6th, there were people holding the Confederate flag of the Confederacy. But they ignored the fact that there were a huge amount of Israeli flags in the crowd, that the Falun Gong, the Epoch Times, busted all of their people. The Miami Cubans who hate Fidel Castro, they bust in all of their people. The Shah supporters, the people that fled Iran after the Islamic Revolution, they bust in all of their people, and they were marching with the flag of the Shah. And that Donald Trump kind of built a coalition of all of these extremist groups the United States has backed around the world to do this kind of thing against countries they don't like, whether it's China or the Likud, the hard right Netanyahu supporters in Israel, or the Falun Gong, or I mean, you name it. Every corner of the world where there's like a right-wing extremist group backed by the United States, they were brought, to the Capitol by Donald Trump. And they tried, they tried, Joe Biden really tried to equate the January 6th rioters with China, with Russia, with North Korea, et cetera. But the crowd was all the people the United States has brought in from from the world to fight revolutionary governments. It was essentially a rainbow coalition, if you will, of anti-communists and pro-imperialist forces, of people that have fled their homelands after it had a revolution, of people that are, part of the far right wing, these fascistic groups the United States has backed in Latin America and elsewhere. That's who it was. That's who that crowd was overwhelmingly. And so the kind of things they do around the world that the United States supports them in doing, looks like they did. Now, I don't think January 6th was an attempted coup, though. And I mean, we'll see what evidence they have when Donald Trump goes to trial. I mean, I could be convinced. I'm open to hearing it. But the more I look at it, I think what happened on January 6th was an act of mass vandalism, trespassing, property destruction. And I also think that it was enabled to happen by the FBI. I've been to many protests in Washington, D.C. You can't just walk into the Capitol, right? You can, no matter how big the crowd is, the police don't just let you walk in, right? And the fact that it happened the way it did, and the details about, Ray Epps and others, it looks to me like this was allowed to happen for political purposes. But we'll see. I really doubt that Donald Trump had in his mind that he was going to be able to, stay in office because these people ran into the Capitol building. I don't see that adding up.
And I'm just saying, in China, there's no sympathy for that,
Yeah.
because what they're doing in Hong Kong, and not that long ago in Belarus, in Ukraine, they have been doing this all the time. And so all of a sudden, okay, it's happened in your Capitol Hill. What's the big deal?
And it was the same people, and that's the word. I mean, it was the very same people. I mean, Donald Trump, and that there's a contradiction, because all of these groups, the Falun Gong and the Miami Cubans and the Shah supporters of Iran and the Likudniks in Israel, and all of them have their own specific agenda. They have a vendetta against a particular country. Whereas Joe Biden and his forces, they represent kind of the overall geostrategic interests of the United States. Whereas all of these kind of fanatical groups the USA has imported over the years, they all have a very specific, agenda that they don't care about whether the United States stays dominant in the world and all of that. What they care about is they want to overthrow the Chinese government, or they want to overthrow the Iranian government, they want to overthrow the Cuban government. They want to support the settlements and escalate against Iran, and they have their own agenda. And Donald Trump kind of made this coalition of those forces, and it's the the geopolitical establishment out of Harvard and Yale and all of them. They're the ones that are saying, well, we're just using you people. We have our real agenda, and these people, they have their own individual interests. People compare this to the fall of the Roman Empire. During the time that Rome was declining, Rome had made a point of importing all kinds of religious groups and sects from around the empire, of people that would do their bidding. And as Rome was declining, Rome lost the ability to even mobilize its own army. And when they were fighting the Germanic tribes in the last years of the Roman Empire, they couldn't even build up their own army to fight them. So they had to hire other Germanic tribes to fight the Germanic tribes they were fighting. And increasingly in the U.S. military, we use what's called green card soldiers, which are people from South America and Central America who get their U.S. citizenship because they'll fight. Our population is not signing up and is not physically fit enough to fight in the wars, does not have the psychological stamina to fight in the wars, and that this is a symptom of empire and decay, and that I think January 6th very much plays into it. And you're absolutely right in what you're saying about this is what U.S. aligned forces do all around the world, and largely it was those forces that were involved in what happened on January 6th. And I think that point can't be made enough. I think it's a really important point to understand.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sight to behold in the eyes of the Chinese. Okay.